So everyone should now, according to my screen, be seeing my PowerPoint. So as I have already said, hello everyone, I am Jackie Kauza. I am a visiting assistant professor at Indiana University East. And today I am going to be sharing some of my recent research on social work instructors' writing related expectations for their students. So in particular, we'll be doing a deep dive into synthesis in social work assignments, and particularly assignments that mimic client assessments that practicing social workers write. So to start, just a little context for what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to give a little context for the background of this study. I'm going to give a short synopsis of some of my research methods. Then I'm going to talk in detail about social work synthesis based on my research. And then I'll wrap up with a few comments about what findings like these suggest about opportunities for teaching for transfer. So the findings that I am discussing today are part of a larger study aimed toward digging into how instructors in other disciplines teach students to write, as well as what those instructors value in their students' writing. So studying instructor pedagogy, assignments, writing expectations can ideally enhance understanding not only of disciplinary classrooms, but of the broader disciplines themselves. Because scholarship suggests that instructors may often try to impart their own disciplinary writing related values to their students. And also considering instructors' written assignments can reveal not only the instructor's goals for that particular class, but also some of the goals and values that they have as members of broader disciplines as well. And this may be particularly true in a field like social work, where the instructors are often preparing students to enter into a particular career field. Now, as many writing in the discipline scholars are likely aware, disciplinary writing expectations are often tacit. So instructors can be very entrenched in their disciplinary writing practices, so entrenched that the practices seem intuitive, they seem like common sense, and so instructors may not always realize what students don't know about the writing expectations in a disciplinary context. And some scholars suggest students may be able to learn disciplinary ways of thinking and writing more quickly with explicit guidance as to what those disciplinary ways of thinking and writing are. But the issue, of course, is that instructors may not always realize when explicit guidance is necessary, or they may not even have a grasp of how to make things that they have come to know implicitly, how to make them explicit. However, explicit instruction in disciplinary writing may not only help students to integrate more swiftly and successfully into their disciplines, but it may also help to combat some inadvertent gatekeeping that implicit writing expectations can cause. So in other words, explicit instruction in disciplinary writing may thus result in more just and equitable pedagogy that can help marginalized student populations or first-generation students or non-native English-speaking students better succeed in academic contexts. Because of this, research to better understand disciplinary writing expectations may support disciplinary instructors in more effective teaching, and it may also help those involved in writing instruction, so people like composition instructors, writing tutors, those groups of people. It may help them better help students identify opportunities for transferring what they know to new contexts. Now, for my own research, in her work on writing-centered discourse analysis, Therese Thonis states that her strategy as a researcher is to begin with descriptions of what is, rather than provide prescriptions of what should be. And this is what I am trying to unearth about different disciplinary writing expectations with my research. So the what is, what are instructors in the disciplines teaching students, not only about writing specifically and explicitly, but what are they teaching them about some of the disciplinary ideologies and values that may influence and shape the instructor's disciplinary writing expectations. So for this study, I used several methods to collect data. I conducted a semester-long observation in an upper-level social work course that was focused on generalist social work practice with families. The instructor, Scott, was also a practicing social worker in addition to being a course instructor. During my observations in the class, I attended to the topics that Scott was discussing. I was looking at the ways of thinking he was modeling, and I was also attending to, of course, the writing practices that he was describing. I then conducted several interviews with Scott, and I asked him both about subjects from the class as well as about his assignments. I also analyzed Scott's assignments as well as his feedback on them to students. And then finally, I interviewed 6 additional social work instructors. And so when I was talking to them, in addition to inquiring about their assignments and their goals and expectations for student writing, I asked them explicitly if they shared similar expectations to Scott to determine where there was overlap, like where some values were shared among multiple instructors in the discipline. So after coding and analyzing all of these data, I found several trends in instructors' expectations for student writing and assignments, and several of these were linked in interesting ways to values of the discipline of social work. Now, the findings that we'll be focusing on here, as the title of the presentation suggests, is synthesis in social work assignments. So specifically, we'll be considering assignments that attempt to mimic documents that students would be producing when they moved on and became practicing social workers. The most common of these assignments among my participants was a client assessment, which is a document in which a social worker makes note of client behaviors and thoughts and perspectives and proposes suggestions for therapeutic interventions based on those observations. So Scott and the 6 other social work instructors all agreed that synthesis is a critical skill in social work writing, and that's a perspective that was echoed in some of the scholarship by social work scholars L.3 and Adkins. Synthesis was also something that instructors looked for in student papers. However, social work synthesis is quite complex. Scott stated that synthesis in social work assignments must be both descriptive and concise, documenting nuanced, observation-based information while also presenting that information in a readily digestible way. So an element of social work synthesis then is the integration of rich detail in a compact format. And Scott expressed that while a social worker must synthesize a client's story in a cohesive clinical way, that social worker cannot synthesize to the point where you lose the stories. Now, that doesn't mean that Scott was averse to clinical terminology in social work writing. He really wanted students to incorporate clinical terminology in their social work texts in his class. Scott, however, didn't want to sacrifice the richness and realness of a client's experiences in favor of overuse of jargon. So he didn't want to lose the stories that clients could tell in favor of terminology. Those stories, however, did need to be presented in a compact, concise way. A social work synthesis must thus include structured and purposeful detail, and then a client assessment needs to include clinical interpretation of that detail. So this particular genre for social work writers must inform a reader as to the social worker's observations and then suggest interpretations of those observations for a reader. It seems then that an effective social work synthesis should provide a reader with both a targeted snapshot of the client's experience and the social worker's interpretive perspective. So it's a document that needs to balance personal experiences and clinical assessment that needs to balance between richness and conciseness. And so the process of social work synthesis involves winnowing relevant details gathered during observations, presenting a succinct yet rich account of those details, and then interpreting those details through a professional clinical lens to propose hypotheses as to possible issues impacting clients or their situations. So considered in broad strokes, this process of social work synthesis matches some of the synthesis definitions outlined in a variety of composition and weighted textbooks. As discussed in these textbooks, then the process of synthesis involves selecting information from multiple sources, connecting and organizing the most relevant information from sources, and then using that information to create a new interpretation or conclusion. This process aligns with the constructive process for discourse synthesis that Spivey outlines in her foundational work on this subject. So in her research, Spivey identifies selecting, organizing, and connecting as the 3 processes writers employ to make meaning from sources and to restructure source content in order to make meaning in their own texts. In composition scholarship, as well as textbooks, the practice of synthesis involves selecting and connecting information from multiple sources and often condensing and reframing that information to create new discourse frameworks and different representations of meaning. So the basic process of synthesis, as discussed in composition, has several similarities to the process of synthesis in social work. Synthesis in social work requires drawing on diverse details gathered from different observations of and encounters with the client, determining which of those details are relevant and illuminating, and then fitting those details into the structure of a social work text like an assessment. So in doing so, a social worker gives those details new meaning, using them to ground the social worker's professional interpretation of what those details might indicate about the client and the client's situation. However, despite the similarities of process, there are some pretty stark differences between the synthesis discussed by the social work instructors who participated in my study and the synthesis discussed in the field of composition. So many composition textbooks, as you can imagine, and other composition studies discuss synthesis as a practice conducted with source texts. While synthesizing in social work involves connecting and interpreting observed details, synthesis in composition is regarded most frequently as a text-based practice. In fact, discussions of synthesis and composition are commonly featured in articles that are exploring the teaching of reading, with synthesis cast as a skill that is influenced by reading comprehension and reading ability. Now, Scott's assignments did require students to consult some peer-reviewed secondary sources, but his comments about synthesis were not really focused on putting those sources into dialogue with one another. It was connecting observational data and posing reasoned clinical hypotheses based on those data that was considered as a far greater concern for Scott. He was much more interested in that than his students' abilities to connect different sources. And other participating instructors too were most often discussing synthesis through the lens of social work practice, how to synthesize this observed information. So synthesis was a task their students would engage in with observed details on the job, not necessarily with text-based sources as one might expect in a classroom. Now, composition scholars note that synthesis is a complex task that often proves challenging for students, and I'm sure many instructors who have tried to teach synthesis in a composition course would agree. Despite some of the differences between synthesis and composition and synthesis and social work, though, social work synthesis still seemed to be equally challenging for social work students. Several of the instructors suggested that this was something that students would struggle with in their class, with determining how to synthesize that observed information. And they talked about, because social work students are new to the field because they lack expertise, they would also lack the experience necessary to winnow critical detail down from excess information. So what does that information or evidence in social work assignments that mimic professional social work genres look like? In social work writing, like client assessments, evidence, as I've said, would need to be observable data. A social worker should document clients' actions and behaviors. And when working with students on example case studies, Scott would regularly prompt students to describe what they were observing rather than make assumptions about it. So for example, he might prompt a student to write something like, the youngest child regularly interrupts her mother and rarely sits still for more than a few minutes, as these are observable actions and behaviors. It's something that has been witnessed, as opposed to writing without any link to observed actions and behaviors. The youngest child may have ADHD. It's unclear what that observation is based on. What did the social worker witness to lead them to think of that? Another work instructor explained that she prompted her students to write behaviorally, describing what they observed. And Scott instructed his students to ground their hunches or ideas or thoughts in concrete observations. He told them, whenever you think you feel something going on with a case, try to pinpoint what made you feel that way. Readers in looking at social work texts may also interpret subjective descriptions, so something like good parenting or clinical diagnoses based on their own experiences or their own biases. So if social workers are not documenting what they observed, their readers may not be understanding exactly what has been going on as it is presented in the social worker's text. So once evidence has been drawn from observation, then a social worker can start to make inferences about what that evidence reveals or suggests. And Scott described this process as look at what the person does, the client does, and then translate what that might tell you about the person. A social worker's hypotheses are then grounded in evidence that the social worker can pinpoint and that other readers can independently assess. So when one of Scott's students described a client as selfish, for example, this word choice represented a failure to write behaviorally. Readers would each have their own ideas of what selfish behavior might look like. And additionally, a reader could not infer what the client's actual behavior was from this descriptor. It wasn't clear what the client had actually done. This text would then not function as an assessment of the client, but only as a documentation of the social worker's opinions of the client's behavior. And that's not to say that a social worker's perspective is out of place in an assessment, as they do need to make some of those interpretations about the client's behavior. Scott wanted students to draw some conclusions about what certain behaviors might indicate about a client or about a family system. But one student who received particularly positive feedback on her presentation of evidence followed a textual pattern that was something like this. This is possibly X issue as evidenced by Y and Z observed details all considered together. She would make those sorts of moves in her writing. So the student was both presenting a hypothesis and then providing a targeted descriptive selection of observed evidence to show how she had formulated that hypothesis by connecting those different pieces of evidence together. So students struggling with synthesis in Scott's class generally seem to include either too much anecdote, so they're going into too much observed detail, or they were not sort of doing enough synthesis of details, or were not making that shift from observation to interpretation. In other words, students grappled with finding the balance between stories and the clinical assessment that is key in this disciplinary genre, and also with determining how much evidence to include to support a hypothesis. And this is perhaps not dissimilar to how students in writing classes may struggle with how to incorporate their own critical thinking and analysis into discussion of text-based sources, or how they may struggle with how much content from sources they should include in their own texts. And so this brings us to the subject of transfer and the question of how learning more about writing in different disciplinary contexts can help with the teaching of transfer. And so the shift from synthesizing text in a course like a first-year writing course to synthesizing observed details in social work courses may be an example of high road or far transfer. So it's transfer that may require some deliberate thought to identify connections between somewhat dissimilar contexts. However, if instructors, whether composition instructors or disciplinary instructors, are more aware of some of those similarities, they can better prime students to recognize connections across tasks and contexts. So individuals like first-year comp instructors or even like writing center tutors can potentially help students identify how synthesis of text is similar or dissimilar to synthesis of observed details. And these individuals can help students identify how what they already have some experience with can be adapted, reshaped, and carried forward into new contexts. And similarly, disciplinary writing instructors who have some insight into the skills like text synthesis that students may have learned in a first-year comp course can reach back and prompt students to consider how what they already know can be reworked to fit a new setting. Now, the transfer won't be one-to-one given the difference of the tasks, but there are enough similarities there that with prompting, transfer may be undertaken with some success. And so further research into disciplinary instructors' writing expectations and disciplinary values can help scholars identify some of these similarities, which can ideally be incorporated into WAC programs and initiatives to create a more interconnected writing experience for students, where similarities and differences between contexts are made more explicit and thus hopefully more accessible to a wider range of students. If anyone is interested in references, please let me know. I'll be happy to share those slides. But for now, I want to say thank you so much for your time and attention with my presentation. Let me stop sharing of my screen here. Oh, thank you very much. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat at any time, but we won't be responding to them until the end of this session. We'll also be happy to take them sort of live at the end of the session. For now, we'll shift our attention to Dr. Sarah Banting and her discussion of uptake academic genres and a new frontier for WAC.
Thanks, Jackie. Oh, the host disabled participant screen sharing. I imagine that's going to change like momentarily.
Absolutely. I apologize.
That's okay.
One moment here.
In the meantime, I'll just say hello, I'm a associate professor in the Department of English at Mount Royal University, which is in Calgary in Canada, and on Indigenous territory there. And I'm not directly involved with a WAC program. I have ambitions to be one day, or for there to be that kind of initiative at my university. But today I'm thinking about how my research kind of bridges towards WAC. So I should be able to go ahead maybe now. Yeah, looks like I can. Thank you. Yay. Okay, so my presentation today has to do with scholarly genres, the research genres used by professional scholars, and in particular, the research article. And I'll be focusing on getting my view proper. Okay, on what has surprised me recently by being the shifty, impermanent, rewritable character of these genres. Scholarly genres interest us in WAC, of course, because the genres that disciplinary professionals use to get things done influence the writing performances they expect of students. And Jackie just showed us that influence playing out in social work. I pay a special attention to literary studies, and I'm interested in other humanities disciplines where the professional extension of students' work would be a scholarly academic one. Like many of us in this WAC community, I've long drawn on the insights of rhetorical genre theory and approached genres as types of situated social action, as ways of suitably and effectively getting things done in a particular social situation, so that the primary criterion for assessing a piece of writing is whether other participants in the situation recognize it as effectively undertaking and accomplishing a suitable action. Today, I want to briefly share some research results that illustrate a complication in this way of looking at research genres, a complication that has been startling and even troubling me recently, not least for how it undermines the potency of writing to act, to get things done in a research context. And then I want to speculate about what this complication might mean for teaching writing in the disciplines across the curriculum. So here goes. Generally, I think those of us who study research genres, but those of us who write them, have thought of them as effective, more or less. So long as they've passed peer review and gotten published, we think that these pieces of writing effectively do things. As a shorthand, we say that they make knowledge, or at least in Charles Basserman's phrase, they make statements of knowledge. And importantly, research genres are written as if they do things, as if in themselves they take action. In the discipline that I've been studying, literary criticism, for example, research articles make claims like these ones. They claim that the essay itself will investigate things, that it will show things, that it will shed light or help make sense of certain things, that the article itself will seek to engage, that it will suggest things. Now, the complication I mentioned for all of this is the very persuasive argument articulated most fully by Anne Friedman in particular, that a genre doesn't do anything by itself, not really. Whatever it accomplishes only thanks to uptakes, to people taking the writing and doing something with it for their own purposes. Friedman made clear right from the start of her work that uptakes translate, transform, sometimes mistake, always remake the genres that as they take them up for their own purposes. I've seen the transformative force of uptake illustrated recently in studies of public genres, where work by Anisba Warshi, for instance, has illustrated how ineffective certain public genres are at defining their own effects. It's the uptakes of those genres that make something of them. But now, since research genres operate within the more conservative, routine-bound, institutionalized discourse communities of academia, we might have expected that, unlike public genres, they would not be so impotent as to be unable to direct their uptakes, or at least say such preeminent genres as the research article would prompt uptakes that would be dutiful enough to take up the article's knowledge-making actions with some accuracy, maybe. We might have expected, in other words, that when a research article claimed to have made a particular bit of knowledge, and when peer review processes determined that it had done so substantially enough to be published as such, that article's uptakes would carry forward, report, build on that precise little bit of made knowledge. But no, currently I am studying uptakes of research articles in literary criticism. Those uptakes coming in the form of published citations of those research articles in subsequent academic research. And here's a sketch of my study. For an earlier project, I had gathered a random sampling of 28 research articles, and I'd read them carefully to determine what these articles claimed to be trying to do, what social actions they claimed to be undertaking. Now I'm examining the research articles and book chapters that have subsequently cited those 28 articles to see how those subsequent works take up that research. Now I'm only partway through that study. I've looked closely so far at how 7 articles have been taken up by a total of 17 subsequent works. But if you'll permit me to share very preliminary findings, what I've been finding is that professional scholars' citations of other scholars' prior published works transform those prior works, selectively remaking them in a variety of ways. And this is just what uptake theory would suggest we'd find. For starters, while many of the uptakes do transform a prior research article into an assertion of a claim or an articulation of a concept that does closely resemble something that the article itself placed prominent and central focus on, a claim it did assert or a concept it did define. Nonetheless, these transformations elide much of the work that the article itself claimed to undertake by, for instance, filtering out all of the article's kind of specific focus, its topic, its questions, and representing the article, its topic in only kind of the most generalized, abstract way. Or by contrast, by representing only kind of concrete details from the article's analysis of specific materials. Or the citation transforms it by partitioning the article's study and representing only one of its major sub-arguments as if that were the whole of its claim. I'd be happy to show you an example during discussion. So importantly, research done by other scholars than me in other disciplines from across the disciplinary spectrum indicates that such selective, filtered, transforming uptakes are not some idiosyncrasy of the professional disciplinary practice in literary studies alone. We might have wanted to think so, but no. So citations in research articles from chemistry too have been found to gradually compress and standardize their accounts of prior studies' findings. H.G. Small, who studied these citations, remarked that scientists need to be able to simplify and standardize each other's findings, even to the point of transforming them in order to build on them. Claire Hemmings has shown something similar to be at work in research on feminist theory. And a study of medical researchers' citations by Jenny Ann Brodin-Donnell looked at how they take up prior studies, indicating that they too selectively subdivide the results that they report and filter them. Donnell even noticed that some of their uptakes are effectively, and in Donnell's terms, empty. The citing articles transform the cited studies into something that, in Donnell's words, does not relate to any of the main content in the cited studies. Perhaps you'll understand why these findings have been troubling for my assumptions about scholarly writing in the disciplines. They suggest that professional research writing is not as independently, securely effective as I thought it was, and that citations, by contrast, do far more work than I recognized. Now, of course, we already knew that citations do a huge amount of work in professional research writing, They allow the current researcher to construct a research space for her work among prior studies. They allow her to highlight her work's novelty and contribution. But uptake theory and my own results and these others' work makes clear that in selectively representing these prior studies, the current researchers' citations decide what those studies did, decide it more forcefully than the published text of those studies themselves can. And my own work shows that they decided differently than the writer of the research article itself did. The force of that decision-making is especially evident when, as according to Small and to Hemmings, over time, the research community's citations of a particular study, if it's lucky enough to get lots of citations, over time, the research community's citations start to coalesce, to repeat each other as they seem to arrive at a collective, agreed upon determination of what knowledge that study made. Okay, so to bring this home to WAC, I'd like to speculate now about what all of this implies for the teaching of writing across the curriculum in the disciplines. I think it raises questions about how we assess student writing and how we assess student uptakes of others' writing. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about this when we conclude. For starters, if in certain areas of the curriculum, we and our colleagues are assigning scholarly writing tasks to students, then emphasizing and assessing the products of students' work, the research papers or whatever the students produce, perhaps makes even less sense than we might have thought. How the work is taken up by others could become a key focus of how we assess students' scholarly writing. That might mean looking less at how soundly, coherently, or rigorously the student work undertakes knowledge-making action, and looking more perhaps at its portability, its catchiness, or of all things, its plasticity. I wonder, for example, if instructors might consider assessing student scholarly writing by considering its relative usefulness for their own research projects. Asking themselves, does this offer me something I might cite? How eager am I to make something of this? Now, there are ethical problems with such a self-centered approach, I realize, but the instructor's own uptakes would at least be readily available to consult and would be more or less authentic feedback about how interesting the student work is to the disciplinary research community. Alternatively, we might consider assessing a student's scholarly writing by tracking how other students take it up in their own subsequent assignments, if they could read and work with each other's work. This strategy has some precedent in composition pedagogy already, and I've done versions of it with my own classes. But I've never yet taken it to the point of letting other students' uptakes decide what was meaningful about a given student's research writing. I wonder how that would work. The real trick is criteria for assessment. So perhaps we'd award, and I was wondering about criteria earlier, you saw me, perhaps we'd award the highest marks to whatever student's scholarly writing left out, like a sharp but pliable impression, whatever written ideas were attractive and plastic enough for the uptaker to spend time remodeling them into a bold new statement. Or could we assess a student text effectiveness by tracking whether other students care enough about it to decide a new meaning for it? My facial expressions, I think, are suggesting that I feel a little bit at sea in all of this speculation, but I'm thinking about it. As I mentioned, my own findings and others also raise questions about how we assess students' uptakes of others' research. How could we model our criteria for assessing students' uptakes, say the quality of their summaries and their citations? How could we model how we assess that on how professionals practice without getting too nervous? So that is, on what criteria might we differentiate high quality student uptakes when professional practice of taking up is so freewheeling In my own teaching, I've so far always been using accuracy as a major criterion for assessing students' summaries. Like, is it an accurate report of what that writer wrote? And maybe that's still okay to a degree, even in light of my findings. Maybe professional researchers would agree that what Donnell calls empty citations, accounts of prior research that bear zero resemblance to the cited work, perhaps they'd agree that that's bad practice. But if knowledge ultimately is made by an after the fact communal coalescence of decisions about what a research text said, and if that communal decision about what a text said may differ from what it actually said, then accuracy is not the only criterion. Should something like deftness or sprightliness or creativity become criteria for assessing quality of citation? Oh, how deftly did you center out the central topic of that research article, mining from it just the treasure you needed for your own purposes? How elegantly did you partition the research article's argument, resizing it to fit your needs? I'm speculating a bit playfully here, trying to push myself to think seriously about the implications of what I'm finding. Perhaps it's worth noting that I do find myself wanting to insist on standards of quality in citation. Thinking about as observing, as I do this research, how citations can vary or alter the statements of knowledge that research articles make, making them recognizable, like the reports of the research article unrecognizable to the article itself, or how citations can bring to the surface small kind of trivial details from the articles, presenting them as significant results, even when the paper didn't support them as such. Noticing that, I find myself wanting to insist that citing well, accurately, fulsomely is now even more a pressing responsibility in research writing, whether that's done by students or professionals. I notice myself thinking that reading as part of writing across the curriculum in summaries and citations must be taught with a new wariness, a new sense of urgency, because of how uptakes make knowledge rather than simply reporting it. But I wonder if maybe it's that I have habitually operated in this role as instructor, as someone who's had to assess student scholarly writing rather than just make use of it or not for my own research purposes. Maybe it's that instructor role is all that's making me want to clutch at ideas of duty, responsibility, obedience in citation. At any rate, it seems to me, and here's my concluding note, that we who research, teach, administer writing across the curriculum in the disciplines might start thinking about whether, when we and our colleagues invite students to practice scholarly genres, whether we might want to take more seriously the unseriousness, the impotence even of these genres as professionals practice them. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to discussion.
All right, awesome, Sarah, thanks. And thanks everyone else for listening to our presentations. We have, I think, done well of staying sort of right on time. So yeah, now we would like to just open the floor to discussion. Any questions, comments for either myself or Sarah or both of us, feel free to chime in.
I think I do have a question. I really enjoyed both of those presentations, and they really have me thinking a lot about the textual moves that grad students, I'm thinking of grad students mostly here, have to make to achieve the kinds of writing that you're talking about. I do a lot of work with social work students, and we do talk a lot about synthesis, and your presentation, Jackie, really has me thinking in a different way. But with both of you, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, like, how do you teach a grad student to do the kind of specific textual moves that you're talking about? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the question of how to teach a grad student to make specific textual moves, or teach any student how to make specific textual moves, is sort of like we could write many, many books on that, and they have. From my perspective, I think one of the things that it can be valuable to do is start, looking at, some model text, some example text that are making the moves effectively, and then really get into sort of those conversations, more explicitly about like what this text is doing and why what this text is doing is effective. I know from my own experience as a graduate student, when I started thinking more in that way, it eventually came to be a moment of sort of things just kind of clicked. And it was like, oh, looking at like how they're doing it and really trying to dig into the nitty gritty of talking explicitly, like here they're making sort of this move, they may be trying to accomplish, this purpose, that kind of thing, which can definitely be challenging, given that oftentimes the texts are dealing with subject matter too that can be new or different to students that they're trying to wrap their heads around. And so I think it then becomes a balance of, how do we intermingle like subject matter with explicit conversations, about writing moves that are being made. But like with synthesis, in social work, a couple of the times when I was finding myself coming to a better understanding was when, Scott, the instructor I was working with, was sort of talking me through some examples or showing me some examples that I could then compare. And so I think part of the teaching can come into doing some of that, fine grained sort of digging, and then some of that looking for, more ways to discuss explicitly what different sorts of texts are doing. Sarah, what do you have to add to that?
Oh, I mean, what you offered was great. And I guess I can only add just that when I think about citation as a disciplinary practice, right? Like one that scholars are doing across disciplines, but in probably in different ways, and the ways that they're condensing and manipulating and transforming prior research as they represent it is going to be different across disciplines, and of course, according to different kind of documentation styles. But I'll just say that I think graduate students' citation are probably the most scrutinized. It's probably the most scrutinized of, probably more than most undergraduates' citations, and I would say certainly more than most professional researchers' citations by like what I'm seeing. So graduate students are having to demonstrate the accuracy and comprehensiveness of their understanding of authoritative text, even as they navigate a position in relationship to that. So I guess I don't know how you teach it, but at minimum, you'd say we'd have to recognize what they're up against, like the challenges of trying to write in relation to other voices when they're meant to be both demonstrating obedience and somehow like, I don't know, power. But maybe like we'd have to recognize the challenges they're up against, but also offer the encouragement that the way professionals practice in relation to others is really quite free. So they can, we could try to offer them the freedom to act freely. Maybe that's not very helpful.
Very helpful, both of you. Thank you.
Cool. And then I see Angela has a hand up, I think.
Yeah, and my apologies not to have my camera on. There's just
no
a mess
problem
behind me.
It's all good. No worries at all.
So I guess just sort of picking up on this question of how to teach the textual moves and how to really make explicit what are implicit disciplinary values and practices in producing sort of like these closed form formal texts, like forgive me, I'm going to forget, the client analysis. Is that what the
a client assessment?
Client assessment, or in citation, and that just always makes me think of Graff and Birkenstein's "they say, I say" and use of templates. So Jackie, I was thinking back to was sort of one of the writers had come to a kind of template of like the client may be demonstrating X because of Y actions, Z behaviors, etc. So I guess like a question that I'm still figuring out how to formulate is what role that kind of template may play in pursuing that kind of like closed form disciplinary genre or citation practice. And I'll just share, like, I carry with that a concern about ways in which such templates and like teaching explicitly, like, do this with your text, could shortcut or short circuit those disciplinary ways of thinking, reading, posing questions, pursuing possibilities that we would hope, as experts in that discipline, that final textual product reflects, but also kind of masks over. Like, there's a lot of thinking that went into arriving at that sentence. So I'll just leave it sort of like trailing off there, but I see you nodding, so I think you get what I'm trying to get at.
I think so. I think so. If I am going off base, feel free to rein me back in. But I think you bring up a good point about templates, as with any sort of teaching or understanding tool, I guess, can be used. I don't know if being used for good or evil is too extreme, but they can be used effectively, and then they can also be used in a sort of regressive or limiting way. And I do think it is a risk, as you're doing sort of any sort of teaching tool, that if taken too far, it can become a negative thing. And I think that is definitely true with templates as well, because you don't want students to fall into the trap of like, this is the one right way to do it. It must be like plug and play, you must put in particular words at a particular time. And so I think and this is another thing, this could be a book, this is a conversation that you want to continue having. And that I think there's a fine line between giving students who are very new to a discipline and to a kind of thinking, a sort of like training wheels that they can use to sort of bear the weight of some of the thinking, because I mentioned before that in doing writing, students who are new to a field are often grappling with, they're trying to understand the subject matter. They're trying to understand how to write about the subject matter. And so that's often like a very heavy weight to carry. And so I do think that, things like not a template that one has to follow, with great, precision and focus, and this is the only right way to do it. But I do think a template can sometimes be a useful sort of training wheels type tool to like carry some of that weight. So if they can think more about like the subject matter, if you want them to think more about the content, giving them a sort of template may help sort of balance that out a little bit more. At the same time, though, I think it's important as an instructor to be like reinforcing to them, like, this is not like a one right way to do something, to introduce multiple ways of looking at something. If you're using sort of examples or model texts, you may find several different ones that are all doing good work, but in different ways, just to sort of give them that demonstration of, what this could look like, so that they're not just sort of fumbling around in the dark trying to figure everything out themselves, but they're also not feeling like trapped within this particular format, like this is the only right way to compose this kind of document or think about it in a kind of way. Sarah, do you have something to add to that?
Oh, I think that was a great response. I just thank you. If I were to just play a little bit at the moment, I think, thank you, Angela, for mentioning they say, I say. And if I think of what I was trying to work with in my presentation, now I'm just aware that whenever we say they say X, that might mean I take them to say that X. I take them as saying X, despite that they didn't really. Or it might mean like somewhere buried in their article, there was this sentence I really liked and it said X or something. There's just a lot, isn't there? There's a lot of simplification in the idea that we could attribute one idea to somebody else. So, right, the template empowers, it obscures, it simplifies.
Thank you for pointing that out. I hadn't realized. Thank you for, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I've been trying to think ever since I embarked on kind of watching closely what scholars are doing with their citations. I've started to wonder, well, what would be a good citation, and would it have to be the page-long thing where this template becomes By studying X using method Y, scholar Z argued this. And what I want to point out about what they said was point P or something. I don't know. Anyway, that's enough.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Angela. Any other questions anyone has? Yeah,
I don't
Julie.
want to stop someone else from asking, but it just occurred to me that the thing that I hear both of you talking about is the thing that I talk to grad students about the most, which is about transparency, right? Like when you're doing a kind of observation-based synthesis, or when you're using citations, the skill comes in explaining and being transparent about how you got there. And I hadn't seen that connection between the two presentations before, but templates seem to make things transparent, but the student has to provide that transparency for their own process in order to use a template successfully. And that seems to be like an analysis process too, that leads to that synthesis. So this, for me, this is just really great, really rich. Thank you both.
Oh, absolutely. Happy to help. Oh, and then, okay, I see Catherine has got a hand raised.
So, hi, yes, Catherine, and background problems, internet problems, so the camera's staying off.
All good, no problem.
But listening, thinking about what you guys are saying, one of my big issues coming from a writing center background is I've had professors who are like, can you work with this student with their citations? And I was like, of course, yes, I can do that. I can do anything. And then I slowly realized that actually, no, I can't, because I can't help them figure out how to, qualify or hedge, because I'm not familiar with how strong the claims are in those original sources. The only way I really can do that is to read the original sources and make my own judgments based on that. And I also I don't know the field, so that I can't say these are the best sources. This is the seminal, this is the guy that, the gal who's at the forefront, this is the breakthrough, this is the model that's closest to what you're doing. So I felt, like, because usually, yes, I can do anything, but I finally had to say, no, I don't think I can do that. And I just want to see what you guys think about that.
Sarah, did you want to?
Are you okay? Yeah, I'll say something, Jackie. I'd love to hear your thoughts after that. Just thinking of Julie's comment about transparency as a key term here. You're pointing to this. Thank you, Catherine. So citations look transparent, right? It looks like here I'm telling you what somebody else said. I'm annotating that, demarcating it. I'm giving you bibliographic information, but they're not really, are they? And indeed, in order to test them, we have to have read what is being cited. And you're right, I think it's too much to ask of someone in your position that you should try and be responsible to the quality of the citation. Like, all you can speak about is form. And I've stopped. Like, I mostly only ask students to cite things that I've already read, which is extremely controlling and constraining in some ways. But because I've been so interested in accuracy of their citations, I've wanted to, train them in what I think of as good transparent reporting, or like good responsible reporting of other research. Anyway, so yeah, I think that's a real issue, and I'm not sure how we get around it if we're going to ask undergraduate students to work with that kind of research.
Yeah, and then I come from a writing center background as well. I was a tutor from undergrad and have continued, doing writing center stuff since then. And it is definitely a challenge when, an instructor is reaching out to you with an expectation of you having, this sort of disciplinary knowledge. And I think it comes back to that idea that I mentioned briefly of people are very entrenched in their own fields, and they sort of assume like, this is just good writing. This is how everyone writes. This is how, the writing that I have seen, other social work instructors, other biologists, other sociologists, this is what writing looks like. And so it feels very obvious to them. It feels very intuitive to them in a way that they don't always recognize as disciplinary, again, because they're just so entrenched in it. It's so normal. It's just what they're encountering every day. And so I think if this is just a, situation where the student is coming to the writing center, you can make it very clear, like, our tutors, they are not necessarily experts in your discipline. We can focus on helping like the form of citations, but we can't attest to the content of citations. One thing that I will say could be interesting is depending on how your writing center operates, some of them that I've worked at have had, closer partnerships with particular instructors, where instructors were looking for particular kinds of support for their students. And if you were in that sort of situation, one thing that you might be able to do if you did not like the tutors will never become experts in the discipline. So, disabusing the instructor of that notion right away, good plan. But another thing that you can do is there's, I think David Pace is the author of something called the Decoding the Disciplines Paradigm, which gives some sort of questions that you can ask of instructors so that they can kind of start to articulate some of the things that are implicit about what they are looking at. And so one thing that you could do if you were working long-term with one of those instructors to support their classes is have them, talk through like a model text with you and articulate some of like, this is what effective citation looks like. Here's why. And as Sarah has observed, that can look like many different things, but just, starting to get that conversation, going, that only being the case though, if this is an instructor that you want to sort of like cultivate a partnership with. Cool. Oh, and then I see a question for Sarah in the chat from Angela. Have you been thinking at all about collaborative writing and assessment as a way to consider uptake more explicitly in your own teaching? Yeah, oh, yeah, we are at time, but maybe Sarah can speak, quickly to that.
Thanks, Angela. Collaborative writing and assessment. Yeah. I haven't been thinking at all about it. So maybe we can chat some other point because I don't see it yet because I'm sure you're onto something. So if people are working together and they're having to talk to each other about who they're citing, how they're doing it, what they're taking up, what they're making with it, then maybe they're going to be a bit more transparent. Yeah, go ahead.
Even like thinking of the possibility of part of students writing assignments being that they cite one another's work, that they remake it, that they build on those interpretations in ways that we see happen so often in literary criticism. That could be really exciting, potentially very complicated. But if we're thinking about, and uptake is a new concept for me, so I'm still kind of grappling with that, but it does seem like it's taking into consideration the very social aspect of disciplinary knowledge building that really I don't think can be grasped by individual grades, individual assessment only of how each student as a single writer executes interpretation and citation in these various ways. It seems like it would need to be within that larger social picture so that as a group collectively, it can be reaching that sort of, meta awareness of how it is that they're taking up each other's interpretations and recreating it through their own writing.
Yeah, thank you. That's really neat. And like, I'd love to imagine that one day I'd be able to teach like that, And all I'm going to say is that is that by, as you mentioned, literary criticism, I'm thinking you're totally right. In those classrooms, often there's a lot of dialogue and that's really fostered. But then typically scholarly essays are authored individually, by contrast to some scientific disciplines where works are done by or like research works are done by large partnerships, groups of people working together in a lab. And so they're like, yeah, they're collaboratively writing and they're building on their own prior research and stuff in different ways. So yeah, the ways different disciplinary practice, different disciplines are isolating or like collaborating with each other, it would be interesting to think about. Yeah, thank you.